Chapter 5 The Toil of Trace and Trail. 30 days from the time it left Dawson, Saltwater Mill, with Buck and his mates at the fore, arrived at Skagway. They were in a wretched state, worn out and worn down. Buck's 140 pounds had dwindled to 115. The rest of his mates, the lighter dogs, had relatively lost more weight than he. Pike, the malingerer, who in his lifetime of deceit had often successfully feigned a hurt leg, was now limping in earnest. Soleeks was limping, and Dub was suffering from a wrenched shoulder blade. They were all terribly footsore. No spring or rebound was left in them. Their feet fell heavily on the trail, jarring their bodies, doubling the fatigue of a day's travel. There was nothing the matter with them except they were just dead tired. It wasn't the dead tiredness that comes from brief and excessive effort, from which recovery is a matter of hours, but it was the dead tiredness that comes from the slow, prolonged strength drainage of months of toil. There was no power of recuperation left, no reserve strength to call upon. It had been all used, every last bit of it. Every muscle, every fiber, every cell was tired, dead tired. And there was reason for it. In less than 5 months, they traveled 2,500 miles, during the last 1,800 of which they'd had but 5 days of rest. When they arrived at Skagway, they were apparently on their last legs. They could barely keep the traces tight, and on the downgrades just managed to keep out of the way of the sled. Mush on, poor sore feet, the driver encouraged as they tottered down the main street of Skagway. This is the last, then we get one long rest, for sure, one bully long rest. The drivers confidently expected a long stopover. Themselves, they had covered 1,200 miles with 2 days' rest. In the nature of reason and common justice, they deserved some loafing. But so many were the men that rushed into the Klondike, so many were the sweetheart, wives, and kin that had not rushed, that the congested mail was taking on alpine proportions. There was also more official orders. Fresh batches of Hudson Bay dogs were to take the place of worthless for the trail. Worthless ones were to be gotten rid of, and since dogs count for little against dollars, they were sold. 3 days passed, by which time Buck and his mates found how really tired and weak they were. Then on the morning of the 4th day, 2 men from the States came along and bought them, harness and all, for a song. The men addressed each other as Hal and Charles. Charles was a middle-aged, light-colored man, with weak, watery eyes, and a mustache that twisted fiercely and vigorously up, giving the lie to the limply, drooping lip it concealed. Hal was a youngster of 19 or 20, with a big Colt revolver and a hunting knife strapped to him on a belt that bristled with cartridges. This belt was the most salient thing about him. It advertised his callowness, a callowness sheer and unutterable. Both men were manifestly out of place, and why they would venture north is part of the mystery of things that pass understanding. Buck heard the chaffering, saw the money pass between the man and the government agent, and knew that the Scott Hatch breed and the mail train drivers were passing out of his life on the heels of Perrault and Francois and others who had gone before. Driver with his mates to the new owner's camp, Buck saw a slipshod and slovenly affair. Tent half stretched, dishes unwashed, everything in disorder. Also he saw a woman, Mercedes the men called her. She was Charles's wife and Hal's sister. A nice family party. Buck watched them apprehensively as they proceeded to slow down the tent and load the sled. There was a great deal of effort about their manner, but no business-like method. The tent was rolled up into an awkward bundle 3 times as large as it should have been. The tin dishes were packed away unwashed. Mercedes continually flustered in the way of her men and kept an unbroken chattering of remonstrance and advice. When they put a close-sack on the front of the sled, she suggested it go on the back. When they put it on the back, she covered it with a couple of other bundles and discovered overlooked articles that could be nowhere else but in that very sack, so they had to unload again. 3 men from a neighboring tent came out, looked on, and grinned and winked at each other. "You got a right smoke load as it is," said one of them. "It's not me that should tell you your business, but I wouldn't tote that tent along if I was you." "Undreamed of!" cried Mercedes, throwing up her hands in dainty dismay. "However in the world could I manage without a tent?" "It's springtime. You won't get more cold weather," the man replied. She shook her head decidedly, and Charles and Hal put the last odds and ends on top of the mountainous load. "Think it'll ride?" one of the men asked. "Why shouldn't it?" Charles demanded, rather shortly. "Oh, that's all right," the man hastened meekly to say. "I was just a-wondering, that's all. It seems a mighty top-heavy." Charles turned his back and drew the lashings down as well as he could, which was not well. "Of course them dogs can hike all the way up with a contraption behind them," affirmed the second of the men. "Certainly," said Hal, with freezing politeness, taking hold of the gee pole with one hand and swinging his whip from the other. "Mush!" he shouted. "Mush on there!" The dogs sprang against the breastband, strained hard for a few minutes, then relaxed. They couldn't move the sled. Lazy brutes, I'll show them, he cried, preparing to lash out at them with the whip. But Mercedes interfered, crying, Oh, Hal, you mustn't, as she caught hold of the whip and wrenched it from him. The poor dears, now you promise me you won't be harsh with them for the rest of the trip, or I won't go a step. Precious, you know all about dogs. The brother sneered. I wish you'd leave me alone. They're lazy, I tell you, and you've got to whip them to get anything out of them. That's their way. You ask any one of those men. Mercedes looked at them imploringly, untold repugnance at the sight of pain written in her pretty face. They're weak as water, if you want to know, came the reply from one of the men. Just tuckered out, that's the matter. They need rest. Rest be blank, said Hal, with his beardless lips, and Mercedes said, Oh, in pain and sorrow at the oath. But she was a clannish creature, and rushed at once to the defense of her brother. Never mind that man, she said pointedly. You're driving our dogs, and you do what you think best with them. Again Hal's whip fell upon the dogs. They threw themselves against the breastbands, dug their feet in the packed snow, got low to it, and put forth all their strength. The sled held as though an anchor. After 2 efforts they stood still, panting. The whip was whistled savagely, and once more Mercedes interfered. She dropped on her knees before Buck with tears in her eyes and put her arms around his neck. You poor, poor dear, she cried sympathetically. Why don't you pull hard? Then you won't be whipped. Buck didn't like her, but he was feeling too miserable to resist her, taking it as part of the day's miserable work. One of the onlookers who had been clenching his teeth to suppress hot speech now spoke up. It's not that I care a whoop what becomes of you, but for the dog's sake, I just want to tell you, you could help them a mighty lot by breaking out that sled. Runners are frozen fast. Throw your weight against the gee pole right and left and break it out. A third time the attempt was made, but this time, following the advice, Hal broke out the runners, which were frozen to the snow. Overloaded, unwieldy sled forged ahead. Buck and his mates struggled frantically under the rain of blows. 100 yards ahead, the path turned and sloped steeply into the main street. Woody required an experienced man to keep the top-heavy sled upright. Hal was not such a man. As they swung on the turn, the sled went over, spilling half its load through the loose lashings. The dogs never stopped. The lightened sled bounded on the side behind them. They were angry because of the ill treatment they'd received and the unjust load. Buck was raging. He broke into a run, the team following his lead. Hal cried, Whoa, whoa! But they gave no heed. He tripped and pulled up his feet. The capsized sled ground covered over him, and the dogs dashed up on the street, adding to the gaiety of Skagway as they scattered the number of their outfit along the chief thoroughfare. Kind-hearted citizens caught the dogs and gathered up the scattered belongings, and they gave advice. Half the load, twice the dogs, if they ever expected to reach Dawson, was what they said. Hal and his sister and brother-in-law listened unwillingly, pitched the tent, and overhauled the outfit. Canned goods were turned out that made men laugh. Canned goods on a long trail is a thing to dream about. Blankets for a hotel, quoted the men, who laughed and out. Half as many is too much. Get rid of 'em. Throw away that tent and all those dishes. Who's going to wash 'em anyway? Good Lord, do you think you're traveling to Pullman? And so it went, the inexorable elimination of the superfluous. Mercedes cried when her clothes bag was dumped on the ground, and article after article was thrown out. She cried in general, and cried in particular over each discarded thing. She clasped her hands about her knees and started rocking back and forth, broken-heartedly. She averred she would not go an inch, not for a dozen Charleses. She appealed to everybody and everything, finally wiping her eyes, proceeding to cast out even articles of apparel that were imperative necessaries. In her zeal, when she finished with her own, she attacked the belongings of her men, went through them like a tornado. This accomplished, the outfit, though cut in half, was still a formidable bulk. Charles and Hal went out in the evening and bought 6 outside dogs. This added to the 6 of the original team, and Teek and Kuna. The Huskies obtained at Rink Rapids on the record trip brought the team up to 14. But the outside dogs, though practically broken since their landing, didn't amount to much. 3 were short-haired pointers, 1 was a Newfoundland, and the other 2 were mongrels of an indeterminate breed. They didn't seem to know anything, these newcomers. Buck and his comrades looked upon them with disgust, and though he speedily taught them their places and what not to do, he couldn't teach them what to do. They did not take kindly to trace and trail. With the exception of 2 mongrels, they were bewildered and spirit-broken by the savage environment and that they found themselves, and the ill treatment they received. The 2 mongrels were without spirit at all. Bones were only things breakable about them. With the newcomers hopeless and forlorn, and the old team worn out by 2,500 miles of continuous trail, the outlook was anything but bright. The 2 men, however, were quite cheerful, and they were proud too. They were doing the thing in style with 14 dogs. They'd seen other sleds pass for Dawson and come from Dawson, but never had they seen a sled with 14 dogs. In the nature of Arctic travel, there was a reason why 14 dogs shouldn't carry a sled, and that one sled should not carry food for 14 dogs. But Charles and Hal did not know this. They'd work out the trip with a pencil. So much to a dog, so many dogs, so many days. QED. Mercedes looked over the shoulders and nodded comprehensively. It was just so simple. Late next morning, Buck led the team up the street. There was nothing lively about it, no strapper going him and his fellows. They were starting dead weary. 4 times he had covered the distance between Saltwater and Dawson, and the knowledge that jaded and tired he was facing the same trail once more made him bitter. His heart was not in the work, nor was the heart of any dog. The outsides were timid and frightened, the insides without confidence in their masters. Buck felt vaguely there was no depending on these 2 men and the women. They didn't know how to do anything, and these days went by it became apparent they couldn't learn. They were slack in all things without order and discipline. It took them half the night to pitch a camp, and half the morning to break the camp and load the sled in a fashion so slovenly that for the rest of the day they were occupied in stopping and rearranging a load. Some days they didn't make 10 miles. Other days they were unable to get started at all, and on no day did they succeed in making more than half the distance used by the men as a basis in their dog food computation. It was inevitable they should go short on dog food, but they hastened it by overfeeding, bringing the day nearer when underfeeding would commence. The outside dogs, whose digestion was not trained by chronic famine, had the most of the little, had voracious appetites, and when in addition to this the worn-out huskies pulled weakly, Hal decided that the orthodox ration was too small. He doubled it. And to cap it all, when Mercedes, with tears in her eyes and a quaver in her throat, couldn't cajole him into giving the dogs more, she stole from fish sacks and fed them slyly. But it was not food that Buskin and the huskies needed, but rest, and they were making poor time. The heavy load they dragged sapped their strength severely. Then came the underfeeding. Hal awoke one day to the fact that dog food was half gone and the distance was only 1/4 covered. Further, for the love of money or no additional dog food was to be obtained, so he cut down the unorthodox ration and tried to increase the day's travel. Sister and brother-in-law seconded him, but they were frustrated by the heavy outfit and their own incompetence. It was a simple matter to give the dogs less food, but it was impossible to make the dogs travel faster, while their own ability to get under way in the morning prevented them from traveling longer hours. Not only did they not know how to work dogs, they didn't know how to work themselves.